commodify your disgust, deconstruct your despair, eat, negate, love. Questa è una pagina di un manifesto, Nein, che è edito anche in Italia da Marsilio in italiano ed è la rappresentazione fisica forse di un'idea, forse di un personaggio, forse di una possibilità per il web. Quel personaggio vive e si autogenera su Twitter con il nome di Nein Quarterly. Nein Quarterly è forse un finto journal accademico, forse è un compendio sulla negazione utopica, forse è un progetto di trolling, forse è uno stand-up comedian, forse è un failed intellectual, come lui si autodefinisce. Questa cosa che si chiama Nein Quarterly ha più di 133.000 follower su Twitter ed è, a mio vedere, una delle cose migliori che come umanità abbiamo prodotto grazie alla rete. Questa cosa in particolare è una persona, Eric Jarosinski, editor di Nein Quarterly. Dal mio punto di vista, al di là di tutto quello che lui dirà oggi, credo che Nein Quarterly sia in grado di definire e dare ai suoi lettori alcune, consigli sulla filosofia, sulla vita, sui sentimenti. E al di là di questo lui è, secondo me, autore del miglior tweet mai inviato, e lo citerò in inglese: I suggest we have a beer, ate everything and fall in love. È un onore per me introdurre Eric Jarosinski.
Hello. I think I heard the word comedian. That is most definitely not the case. Thank you for that. But I want to thank you for coming. I want to especially thank the nihilists for coming. I see there are many of them in attendance. And I especially want to thank you for coming after staying up very late, perhaps watching a certain sporting event that was taking place here. Does anyone here actually watch soccer? Calcio? Some of you? Okay. Because you know how it ended. I think it should have ended differently. This is my reading of the situation. But I think, as we all know, the real winner of last night's competition was, in fact, this tweet, which made its way through a lot of social media over the last many hours. So who am I and what am I doing here? Well, I'm coming really not from the area of technology per se at all, but rather from an academic background in philosophy, in literature, etc. I'm sure you need no reminder about what philosophy is and what it can do, but from, of course, the love of wisdom, the origin of the word. I'm really more from theory than philosophy, which is the love of theory, as you might know, but more specifically from critical theory, which is the love of quiet desperation and impotent rage. Some of you have probably studied this yourself at one time or another. And what I'm here to talk about is a transformation from the life of a quiet, terribly depressed academic professor to a quiet, depressed Twitter phenomenon is the word that's been used somewhat recently, or the Twitter star of the intelligentsia, or perhaps you know me as the Ashton Kutcher of the humanities. And I have to say I was very flattered by Wired having me, and especially by calling me a scrittore, which I felt is a promotion from what I'm normally called, or ideatore, also felt very, very flattered. My own term is, of course, this, but I should tell you that the proper term, just before we begin, is, in fact, der Twittergott. So feel free to refer to me that way. Well, the interesting thing is this. What I've found myself dealing with is something I never thought I would deal with, of terribly miniature internet fame. My 15 minutes, I think, have been up a good 12 or 15 minutes ago. But it's led to an interesting phenomenon in terms of the book that I have written would not have been possible without this experience. It does have its drawback, minor fame. Sometimes you go places, you're happy to see people taking your picture, and then you realize it's not actually you that they're interested in seeing. You show up in a city, and you're happy to see that people are interested in what you're doing in philosophy, and then you realize they're there for something else. Or recently, sometimes there's even resistance to what you're doing. So when I arrived in Milano the other day, I was greeted by this headline. So I have to say, in many ways, it's not the easiest life if you're planning on a transition outside of what it is you normally do into something like this. But I am very happy to be here for any number of reasons. Certainly, as always, I've been to Milan a couple times in the past, and I'm happy to see that fashion is still extremely important here. Oh, so that's not a very good example. Here's a better one. And I felt very welcome, in particular, as where I've been living is situated directly in between the old Wild West and Wiener House. So I have to say that already encompasses much of my own background. And Wired itself, and this festival for me has been part of something I've seen happening more and more, and I'm very happy to see it, the connection between politics, culture, technology, art, etc. Something I like to see more of, and something that in my attempt to translate what I did in an academic sphere into Twitter has involved all of those things. Wired in particular, I think, has done a great job of getting that out there. Their logo, of course, very nicely done. I was surprised that you have to assemble it yourself, but I was, and I think it was also very nice partnering with mass transit, although you might notice they put up the sign wrong. Still happy to see that. But I'm not here to talk about that. I'm talking about a manifesto, nato su Twitter, which, as I understand, is born on Twitter. In some ways, I would say they're born of Twitter. I don't know if that is correct. Or perhaps in some ways even born despite Twitter, in some ways as well, which I'll talk about in a minute. Part of my attempt to goof around with Italian, I tried to learn your language once, did not get very far, a little bit. I've always been interested in it, though, as the language of romance. French, as you know, is the language of love. German, the love of language, and of course English, the love of English. But it's been interesting to observe the focus on technology, not only here for the last couple of days, but what I've noticed in the culture at large. The emphasis on science, on technology, on learning, as I saw recently, a focus on technology at younger ages, very similar to a discussion in the United States, where I'm from. Interesting to see your most recent mobile device is actually, this hasn't made its way to the United States yet. I was somewhat surprised to find that Zucchetti is now referred to as software. And the only other thing that I've worried about to some extent is whether or not it's a good idea to have artificial intelligence trains. And I was especially concerned about Wired itself, which pushes many of these phenomenon. The recent issue, I was expecting to discover something about a new Italian time machine. I realized they were talking about something else entirely. But for me, and what it is that's mattered over the last couple of days has been this discussion. This was, if any of you were at the Jiffy discussion yesterday, discussion of content as culture, culture being greater than words, how you can communicate a lot with a little. And I suppose that the experiment that I've been part of has been one of how, in fact, you can communicate with few words, a lot of culture. And that is not necessarily something new or in any way revolutionary. It is not pointed towards the future. It's a very old tradition in philosophy of the aphorism dating back to the ancient Greeks. Many of you have read the works of Nietzsche and others who use the aphorism to great effect. And for me also, I've been heading not in the direction of newer technology, but having started from Twitter into an older medium, the printed book. This is what this manifesto looks like in the German edition. It was the result of a lot of work I'll talk about now, but I want to talk about primarily the process that went into this transition. If you're interested in something that comes from social media and enters into another realm of culture, you should be prepared for some of the difficulties. But before I describe the difficulties, I should thank, of course, my parents for making it possible. Every proper American thanks his or her therapist. And of course, I would like to thank many fans who have supported what I've done over time very generously financially. This is one of the dangers of a nihilist fan base, is in fact that. God, I guess one thanks. Sorry, that's Marx. Marx actually shows up a fair amount in my work. He was one of the thinkers that I taught most as an academic. And I try essentially not to have the most orthodox reading of Marx influence what it is that I do. As you know, there's a radical reading of Marx and a reactionary reading of Marx, a revisionist reading of Marx, and of course a realistic reading of Marx, which I try to take as seriously as possible. In that what I've found in this transition and essentially translating what it is that I've been learning from Twitter into print is in fact the idea of how can one do a lot with a little? So how it is that you can take a surface level knowledge of something and perhaps do something interesting with it. One of my biggest problems actually as an academic was trying to write a serious academic book that was serious from the beginning and had to continually go deeper and deeper, and as it did, it became narrower and narrower. And I found that I'm much more interested in speaking to a broader audience, but in a very different way. I've called this project one of utopian negation, which I describe as such, partially as a joke, partially not, which we can talk about in a minute with Philip. That's a little bit abstract. The best example of it is probably my own GIF allegory, which I'm sure many of you have seen but did not know was about utopian negation, but that's a pretty good illustration of it. What does that make possible? It makes possible some strange things, a strange type of community, but also brings great pressures with it. In turning a Twitter project that was never meant to become anything at all into something like a publication, we're not just talking about one book, but many books. You're part of a culture industry that I've been studying for many years. And so in a way, a very ironic position to find myself within a system that I had found myself studying from a critical perspective for a long time, and trying to come to terms with that. For me, a lot of what I've done has been very low budget, and what I found, once you have a German publisher, you get better transportation, for instance. You get a lot more support, but I've been happy to see that somehow this odd little book has remained part of the cultural underground. As I saw recently on German Amazon, books frequently bought together, the Nein manifesto and Hiking in Mallorca. So I don't know exactly what that says, but I took that as a sign of some kind of success. Well, that wasn't easy, because when you go from a project that's all your own, that was fueled primarily by a sense of dissatisfaction and frustration and depression with what it is that you are working on, a project is very close to your heart. And so it's hard when a publisher comes and they have ideas about how you can position yourself in a way that can make you more appealing, more in tune with the market, For instance, suggestions to make your message a little softer, perhaps to think about the self-help market, consider the American market, always very important. But I've tried my best to stick to the fundamental principles that have interested me most. This picture of Theodor Adorno, some of you will know. And if you haven't read his work, you're familiar with terms like the culture industry and so on that he was so important in establishing. The aphorism, quip, thought image he's best known for is in German, there is no living a right life in the wrong world, essentially. There is no right life in the wrong world. I've added sort of an extension to that, or anywhere else. And in doing so, exaggerated much of the dark aspect of critical theory. But in doing so, I've also tried to somehow change the image to some extent of what some consider to be simply a depressing interpretation of the world. But it becomes somewhat harder when you're dealing all of a sudden with the culture industry. They have ideas about merchandising. But I was happy. You might notice the teardrop coming down Adorno's cheek here. But I was very happy to see that in dealing with the culture industry, they showed some degree of restraint and respect in their ideas for marketing. Weren't simply about cheapening what it is you're trying to do. Weren't simply selling to the highest bidder. Showed a fair amount of respect for the cultural tradition as a whole. If any of you have followed what I've done online over the years, you know that this painting by Caspar David Friedrich makes frequent appearances in various ways. Again, in an attempt that, well, I have to say that's, I would have saved my applause for this one, but that's not mine. That's somebody else's, as is this. What would Adorno think of this himself? I think that answer is probably pretty clear. Fortunately, some Slovenian philosophers have found a little bit more value in what it is that I'm doing. Some of you will recognize Slavoj Žižek, someone who I write about frequently online in various ways. Again, not in an attempt in any way to somehow, in an attempt to popularize philosophy. I'm much more interested, I've found, in using social media as a way to demystify philosophy more than anything else, to bring it within a different cultural context with a different set of rules. Some of you know I've been working over time to describe what I do, and I've come up with various definitions of the type of comedy that one can do within philosophy and social media. You know the classic definition of comedy, of course, is tragedy plus time. Twitter tragedy plus time minus time. German Twitter comedy, as you all know, tragedy plus time minus comedy, plus fart jokes, plus Hegel, minus Hegel. What does that turn out to look like in the real world? Well, for me, one of the most interesting aspects of taking very specific academic work and putting it into a broader context has been, in fact, the possibilities for a type of cultural connection that wasn't possible before, primarily with German culture. Sometimes you do see headlines like this. Many Germans think poorly about America. It's a bit disappointing, although I understand it. But you can also change that pretty quickly. I myself grew up in a place that was very influenced by German culture, Wisconsin. Many German immigrants went there in the 19th century. Here's the house I grew up in. And I try my best to somehow encourage the study of the language and the culture, although not uncritically. This has probably been the most lasting monument to my efforts, which I've never quite understood since I had a much better idea for that one that they didn't necessarily want. As you can see, sometimes messages are considered a little too dark when you get into the realm of social media. Perhaps you'll be found simply too depressing in a short amount of time. And I can understand that. Sometimes my tweets and the book end up being simply a little bit bleak and hopeless. Oh, sorry, that one's not mine. But others simply try to stick to the things that I first loved and that kept me interested in a cultural sphere, but bringing into a different one, whether those be questions of learning the language, some questions about easy tips for learning a language. But philosophy is, of course, the greatest challenge online with few characters. Always the struggle is, how is it that you can encompass difficult ideas or distill them into something very, very brief? But of course, I'm not interested in simply sticking to the German context. The French, American intellectuals also important. But the thing to remember about all of this is that there is, in fact, no philosophy without those core concepts that continually have to be remembered throughout. Of course, it would be a lie. It would be a lie to claim that Twitter is always this intellectual. This is, in fact, often the case is something very different. But I will wrap up simply by saying that many don't understand the appeal of Twitter in particular. I know the usage numbers are not very great here, but I have to say important about Twitter is the historical context in particular. So that simply do not forget. But the way to print has been through newsprint for me, turning this into a weekly column in Germany, which is the format that I ended up using for this book, which is interesting because I don't know exactly what this genre is, but it's taken on this form. And also relied on a somewhat older form from the 19th century and before, of this sort of ironic critical dictionary. I tried to define a number of key terms that are important to those who are perhaps interested in philosophy in one form or another, interested in language in one form or another, but also important is simply our everyday experience of the world. And that I try to address, as well as, of course, political questions. Oh, I just realized we are in Italy. That's embarrassing. I wasn't planning on using that today. My apologies for that. I'll just skip through the last couple, but no critical dictionary of cultural terms would be complete today without a definition of the selfie, which I tried my best to somehow capture. If you doubt that definition, I have photographic evidence pointing to the fact, but probably the best example is, in fact, this one right here. So thank you very much, and auf Wiedersehen. Thank you. Thank you.
So, vielen Dank. We can do that in German.
No, it's all right. It's all right. It's all right.
I would like to ask you, you provided a perfect definition of utopian negation with a penguin, but I wonder whether you would like to verbalize that in a more academic,
Oh, well, that's not my job
you have
anymore.
A reference list, maybe, I don't know.
But what I would say is for me, primarily, this project of Nein, the period after the Nein has been important for me because it's not a matter of a Nein exclamation point, which is often the way in which it's rendered. It's this sort of very simple protest of simply no to everything, right? For me, I guess the idea of utopian negation is a type of no but, in that a no to very simple answers, whether they be political, intellectual, and the intellectual realm, whether they be also about questions of the sort of everyday utopias that are created for us in advertising and marketing and so on. But that's never the end. And hopefully the challenge that I find in the short form is ways in which you can both negate something, you can point to the contradictions that exist within a concept, but at the same time, the attempt is to point towards how you might think about it differently. That's the great challenge, is to work on all those levels at one time.
And I think that it works perfectly when you combine your intellectual obsession, so Zizek, Adorno, and the other German philosophers, and the penguins. How can you do that? Why, in your opinion, it works? I mean, it's so effective, but what's the magic behind it?
The magic behind it is just that that's an ingenious film. That's outstanding. Well, I think primarily it is simply something that has a lot of appeal, is that there's also a contradiction to work with between what are traditionally high cultural forms and popular culture or mass culture. And obviously bringing those things together is a provocative move when you're dealing with Adorno, who's such a critic of mass culture, but also acutely aware of its power and studied it in great detail and respected its authority in that for him the political stakes were very high for things like cartoons and the movies, etc. So I guess for me it's a matter of bringing all those levels together at once, and it's the contradictions that results that are the interest. I think in general the main thing that I learned is that for as much as one can criticize Twitter, my sense is that you should never underestimate the intelligence of your audience on Twitter. I think Twitter audience is extremely adept at reading irony, at reading several levels at once, at recognizing references to things and so on. So that's something that I've been encouraged by.
So maybe Twitter is the utopian negation itself.
It might be. I would say that for me, a lot of what I write about is in fact the medium. That's been how I've been able to continue to exist on it myself, is that I'm not someone who spent a lot of time online before Twitter, and I would say that spending that amount of time in an online community takes as much as it gives. And I think that's been something that was pointed out in talk after talk yesterday in various ways of how you might become more and more connected to other people within a given community online and less connected to people in your immediate vicinity. It's certainly something that I've experienced over time.
Eric Jarosinski, Nein Quarterly, WNF16.
Thank you.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.